advocacy for the policy implementation, and she's a lawyer as well. Ambreen Shafi, and she works in Washington with governments, inter-government panels, and intra-government panels on advocacy, policy research, and all. She's with us, and she's going to deliver a lecture on the law, because jurisprudence is the only prudence. And when you convert the prudence of a jurist into law, that is the way forward. And before she goes, I would introduce another eminent guest, although he's no stranger here because he is the chairperson of the Board of Sustainable Development Policy Institute. But he's also one of the key person in environment. He was head of the UNCCC, rather founders. He founded it or something, and on environment. And from there, the world started know that at the UN level we need to do something. Mr. Shafkat Khaka Khair. And since then, now there's a lot of literature and his contributions are all over. So I straight away asked Ms. Shafi to take the podium and share her thoughts.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much to the Sustainable Development Policy Institute for having me. I first came to SDPI 12 years ago as an undergraduate student. I had not yet received my degree, but I was studying microcredit and women's empowerment in Pakistan. So I came here to SDPI and used some of your research materials in my undergraduate honors thesis. So it's amazing to me that 12 years later as an environmental lawyer, I get to be back here and seeing that you have grown and contributing still to your incredible work. So as he said, I'm an environmental lawyer based in Washington, D.C. at a think tank, and I consult on issues related to environmental law, climate change, and sustainable development. I have been working on climate change issues for the past 2 years now. From the perspective of an environmentalist and a lawyer, I see the benefits to the world and to the country of Pakistan of facing these climate change challenges with a comprehensive strategy involving all stakeholders. Currently, Pakistan is a leader in this issue. As actually, I'm very humbled to have Ambassador Khaka Khair here because he is one of the foremost leaders on this issue. Pakistan will be taking the world stage in 1 week to negotiate an important international agreement which seeks to protect the Earth from dangerous ozone-depleting substances, known as the Montreal Protocol. And these countries will hope to amend that treaty to include a dangerous greenhouse gas called HFCs. They're hydrofluorocarbons, as most people in this room will know. They're primarily used in insulating foams and refrigerants and air conditioners. So I wanted to take a step back from this issue and look at the issue of climate change from a holistic perspective. Before we start talking about technicalities and HFCs and everything. Pakistan is one of the top 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change, according to the United Nations Development Program report. And actually, we have a journalist here from the Business Recorder. His colleague did a fine job last year of reporting on climate change and that Pakistan is one of the most vulnerable countries. And that journalist in the Business Recorder talked about how, according to UNDP, Pakistan is under threat. Its water supply, its energy, and its food security contribute to massive deaths from heat waves, from global warming, loss of business, increase in reliance on imports, and as their natural resources are depleted. And their high degree of reliance on water from the snow melt from the glaciers, and the fact that global warming is contributing to a massive depletion of these glaciers, all of this leads Pakistan to be extremely vulnerable. In this same Business Recorder article, the journalist says that the costs to Pakistan of climate change are significantly higher as compared to terrorism. And he quotes a figure from the UNDP report that Pakistan may be facing $6 billion in losses due to the effects of climate change, as compared to $1 billion from terrorism. So if you can just imagine this for one moment, that Pakistan's losses incurred from terrorism amount to about $1 billion, Pakistan's losses from climate change amount to $6 billion. So, how does climate change and the Montreal Protocol fit into this picture? The ozone layer protects the Earth from harmful UV rays. It began rapidly deteriorating in part due to the overuse of ozone-depleting substances. So 25 years ago, a gaping hole was discovered above the Antarctica, and the world responded quickly. In 1987, 197 countries, including Pakistan, adopted the original Montreal Protocol, which eliminated over 98% of controlled ozone-depleting substances. And this actually helped reverse the damage done to the ozone layer, and as a co-benefit, prevented the equivalent of 135 billion tons of carbon emissions. So this Montreal Protocol treaty, it is the only international law that has 100% compliance and universal membership, meaning it is actually, as a lawyer, from an international legal perspective, it's the most successful example of international cooperation that we have. So, part of the success of this treaty is the fact that the Montreal Protocol had an inbuilt funding mechanism called the Multilateral Fund that actually paid out countries to phase out these chemicals. So it funded itself. This was part of the brilliance of that design of that treaty. And so the Multilateral Fund to date has dispersed billions of dollars in funds, and it is replenished every 3 years. So under this treaty, the world successfully eliminated the chemicals that the Montreal Protocol established, and what they had to use something in place of CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. So what they began to use in place, even though it was a chemical that was not depleting the ozone, were HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons. The problem with HFCs is that they have high global warming potential. So HFCs, as I mentioned, they're a man-made chemical used in the air conditioning industry, and as the moderator mentioned, it's a greenhouse gas. It absorbs solar radiation reflected back from the planet's surface and traps heat in the Earth's atmosphere. So currently HFCs are the fastest growing greenhouse gas, as much as 7 to 15% increase in some cases. And the cooling devices like the air conditioner here in this room, they can cause, the global cumulative effect could cause HFC emissions equivalent to 8.8 gigatons of carbon dioxide by 2050. That's almost as high as the dangerous level of CFCs were at in the 1980s. So just to give you a picture, this is a short-lived climate pollutant. What does that mean? That means that carbon dioxide, when it's released into the atmosphere, it hangs around in the atmosphere for like 500 years. So, as he mentioned, every country in the world also signed the Paris Agreement last December to cut their emissions, their carbon emissions, which would take a very long time to have an effect on the atmosphere. HFCs, in comparison, they hang around in the atmosphere for about 15 years. So a fast phase down of HFCs will have an immediate impact on the climate, an immediate positive impact. In fact, cutting HFCs by 2020, if the treaty determines that by 2020 will be the year that they begin the phase down, it would avert 100 to 200 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. That is enough to chop 0.5% in rise of the average global temperature. That gets you almost a quarter of the way. That gets you a quarter of the way to your goals in the Paris Agreement. Pakistan is a signatory to the Paris Agreement. So that is a significant achievement. And in fact, it gets Pakistan on its way to meeting its obligations under the Paris Agreement, and it establishes Pakistan as a continuing leader in this environmental effort. In addition, there are initiatives like the Prime Minister's Green Pakistan program, the green benches and courts in Pakistan, the work of the Climate Change Commission, and national legislation, including the Pakistan Environmental Protection Act. All of these together combined with one more strategy. As I mentioned, this is a strategic effort that includes multiple stakeholders. One more strategy could also double the effects of HFC elimination. So you have all the savings of HFC plus if you combine it with energy-efficient technology, which Ambassador Kakachel brilliantly used in his October 1 article in The Dawn, doing more with doing less. You have the same unit of air conditioning supplying the same amount of cooling to your room, but it is twice as energy efficient. Doing more with doing less. And in it, he argues that maximizing your resources and energy efficiency is really the way to sustainable consumption and production and meeting the Sustainable Development Goals promulgated by the United Nations. So that is what these parties, these 197 countries that are gathering in Rwanda this week, that is what they are currently seeking to do. Combining the reduction of HFCs with energy-efficient cooling technology, which research has proven that it will at the very least double the effect of either strategy implemented alone. This is what doing more with doing less really means, and countries that take this initiative should be applauded for doing so, including Pakistan. So, in terms of the legal and the practical aspects, many, I think, concerned in looking at this issue would question who will fund and support this issue, because it's no small feat. If you look at Pakistan's HFC sector, right, the air conditioning sector and commercial refrigerant, domestic refrigeration accounts for about 50 to 60% of Pakistan's market. The other 50 to 60% is mobile air conditioning, so the air conditioners you use in your cars. The transition to take out HFCs from these units and replace them with climate-friendly alternatives, which companies have already developed, will take time, it will take energy, it will take government cooperation with industry players and civil society leaders as well. It will be a huge endeavor over the next many years to achieve this commitment. So the first question, the first step of this phase would be funding. So as I mentioned, the Montreal Protocol was so successful in part because it had an inbuilt funding mechanism. This inbuilt funding mechanism, there's a group of 7 countries that sit on an executive committee, and they replenish this fund every 3 years. And they look at what are the needs of the countries seeking to abide by their obligations. What do they need? What are the steps they need to take to phase down these horrible chemicals and put in high-functioning chemicals that do not harm the environment? This is the multilateral fund. This is what it is used for. In addition, there is the Global Environmental Facility funds lesser developed countries and countries with economies in transition to implement this treaty. There is further assistance from our colleagues at the United Nations. They offer tech transfer and technology assistance through UNDP, which has to date already assisted 120 partner countries to access close to $745 million in funding under the old Montreal Protocol initiative. So it's a model that they have seen that has worked over the last 20 years. And that is why environmentalists and like Greenpeace, environmental activists, impartial non-governmental organizations and technical experts have said that elimination of HFCs provides exponential benefits to the world and to the environment. In addition to this, last week, or 2 weeks ago, at the UN General Assembly, the President of the United States, along with Secretary Kerry in the White House, along with several other donor countries and about 30 private foundations, announced an $80 million fund separately from the multilateral fund to help countries phase out HFCs, to implement policies to promote the Montreal Protocol, as well as I mentioned, energy efficiency. So these private donors have gathered together to put their commitment in a public stage on a world platform to encourage countries to stick with their obligations and help them manage the resources that will be needed to meet those obligations. In addition, the UN Development Program, the UNDP, has put out a report called Protecting the Ozone Layer and Reducing Global Warming. That report features UNDP case studies, including examining technology transfer across different regions. and it summarizes the results and the lessons learned from 1991 to 2014. So it looks at success stories and cases from across the world. All of these resources exist, and I believe that the time has come for Pakistan to educate itself about climate change, about how it's affecting your country. And everyone here in this room is very well versed in these issues and is a leader on this front and can assist in helping the public to become more aware of why the climate change initiatives are so important, and to present you with those facts so that you may determine which causes should be prioritized. And again, as I mentioned, this is a multi-stakeholder process. So the other reason for the success of the Montreal Protocol was really the partnerships, the public-private partnerships. So the buy-in from civil society, like those present here, from the media, like those present here, from leaders like the ambassador here, all of that buy-in contributed to the public becoming aware of the effects of those chemicals that it had on the daily life of human beings. So for example, if Pakistan were to promote energy efficiency, this is one small example. There are research institutions, premier research institutions, that have implemented energy efficiency studies within China, India, and Brazil, and Indonesia. And those research institutions have found that energy efficiency savings amount to billions of dollars back to the companies that operate energy technology, to the government, and to the energy consumers. So in fact, the countries where this is being successfully implemented, the cost savings to the consumer come in just using an energy efficient technology. In other words, you see your bill reduced every month. Something like this in a country that experiences massive load shedding and energy issues like Pakistan would have an immediate effect on the quality of life of the people here in the daily living. It would have an immediate effect on your economy. Everyone who relies upon light and technology and electricity for their well-being of their business would immediately see a return of profits should energy efficiency be implemented. So these are the mechanisms that the Montreal Protocol seeks to install in the parties that agree. And as I mentioned, the world leaders are gathering in Rwanda next week. Although consensus has not yet been reached on the amendment, we do know that the Prime Minister of Pakistan traveled to speak with President Obama in 2015, and after which there was a joint communique. In that joint statement, the President Obama and the Prime Minister reiterated their commitments not only to the Montreal Protocol amendment, but also to combating climate change in general. That statement was followed in 2016 by the U.S.-Pakistan Strategic Dialogue, which took place in Washington, D.C. And in last month's meeting, this September, between the Prime Minister and the President, again at the UN General Assembly, where they discussed climate change as an increasing matter of importance to national security of Pakistan and to the environmental health of the region. So at this stage, you might be asking, what can I do? This is a government issue, this is a world issue, this is what I'm a stakeholder in this in a small matter. What can I do? So I guess the first step I would say would be to educate yourself about this issue as much as you can. The information is out there. I am here as a resource. There are many other experts who are here in Pakistan. But educate yourself as much as you can and those around you as to the effect that this can have on your daily quality of life and the economic and national security of Pakistan. And the second step would be to participate. So to the extent that your education motivates you to participate in this process, you are as much a stakeholder in this as an air conditioning industry player. You are affected by climate change on a massive level, perhaps more than some of you may know. It affects your drinking water, it affects your food security. As I mentioned, it affects your energy sector. All of those things mean that you have ownership over this issue as a Pakistani citizen, as a member of this country. And the third step would be to question the leaders, keep them on track, be a sounding board but play a role in trying to determine whether or not you feel your leaders are following the policies that you feel are in line with what's best for you, and that as concerned stakeholders, that your interests are also being represented. So we hope that this agreement between these countries will take place next week in Rwanda. We know the savings that it will afford every single country on the ground, but particularly Pakistan. And we hope that it fosters cooperation and goodwill, even in the midst of so many struggles and so many challenges to international cooperation that we face today. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen. And I would invite my colleague to please come say a few words if you like, since you have vast amount of expertise compared to me, if you would like. Yes, please. Thank you.
Amreen, thank you very much. Should I put a mic before you start?
I would like to thank Amreen Shafi for a very clear presentation on a subject which may be complex for people who are unaware of this topic. And Amreen, thank you for the several kind references to my recent writings. In Pakistan, very few people read English language newspapers, and so it's very kind of you to refer to them. Now, as Amreen rightly said, the Montreal Protocol, which was concluded, I think, in 85?
87.
Yeah, but came into effect in 87.
Yes, that's right.
Following the necessary ratifications, is one of the most successful agreements in history, and certainly the most impressive, the most successful agreement pertaining to the environment. And I would, in very simple terms, ascribe this success to a number of factors. Number one, the political will. Number one, the sound scientific basis of the agreement. This was an agreement that was dictated by science. This was an agreement whereby, for the first time, governments, policymakers listen to the scientists rather than, showing the traditional disregard and contempt for science. And Professor Molina,
Yes.
who got the Nobel Prize for his work on the substances which deplete the ozone layer, will be remembered in history as the man who initiated the process. Now, there were the other. So first, the government's sort of willingness to listen to science. Second was the political will to take environment and space protection seriously. Now, this political will manifested itself in a number of ways. The most important for developing countries was that the developed countries put money where their mouths were, and in order to implement the agreement. So you have, as you rightly said, the most successful treaty, and several $1 billion were disbursed to developing countries to phase out the initial chemicals, the CFCs.
Yes.
Now the problem was that the CFCs were replaced by a new set of chemicals.
Yes.
And I've heard that there are 19 chemicals which are the most deadly.
Right. Greenhouse gas.
So these chemicals seek to protect the ozone layer, but mess up with the climate.
Yes.
So you have an advantage on the one hand and a very serious disadvantage on the other. When I left in 2008, and the momentum of efforts to include the HFCs was not as strong as it is now.
Right.
And to tell you frankly, it received a big shot in the arm when President Obama included it in the 2013 U.S. Climate Action Plan, that the U.S. will work through domestic action and international leadership to facilitate a gradual but eventually complete phase out of the HFCs. Ambreen, I will be. You have put in words that all the incremental costs, all the costs involved, will be borne by the Montreal Protocol. I am not sure if this proposal has been made, in the work of the working group, because the North America proposal, which is the U.S., Canada, Mexico, does not mention it. It is quite possible, I've heard that the meeting in Dubai last year, which produced the so-called Dubai platform,
Yes.
that was a major breakthrough, and that is why it converted a so-called intractable problem into a low-hanging fruit. In my view, the most important factors for the phasing out of the HFCs will be to basically implement the Indian amendment. The Indian amendment talks about the different trajectories for the developed countries and developing countries. It talks about also the lost benefit or lost profit streams. That I think, with my knowledge of negotiations, I think it is basically a pressure tactic. But the main emphasis in the Indian proposal is that, like you did for CFCs, pay all the costs for the phasing out of HFCs. Now, it's interesting, on the 28th of September, one of the very respected Indian environmental reporters, Sinha, he reported, and I suggest you have a look, in the Indian Express. He said that the costs in India for the transformation of the refrigerator and air conditioning industry will be 90,000 crores, which according to my the Indian exchange rate, it comes to about $2 billion. So you're talking about a major country, but one of the many producing developing countries, talking about 90,000 crore, $2 billion. So will the international community, in this time of budgetary crisis, of financial difficulties and all, will they be able to muster the resources necessary I mean, you have problems about the big climate change fund. That will be the first challenge. The second challenge will be, of course, capacity building for developing countries. I think the success of the Kigali meeting will depend decisively on the developed countries putting something on the table that addresses these two questions. Now, let's come to the Pakistani situation. The Pakistani situation is different from the Indian situation or Brazilian situation or Mexican, because while Brazil and Mexico also claim to be developing countries, they produce HFCs. Pakistan does not produce HFCs. It imports HFCs. So in a way, the challenge here is more simple, is easier than the other developing countries. The problem in Pakistan, Amreen, as I have discovered in my 8 years of very close observation, our reluctance in such matters is always because of our inability to know the consequences of the action. And to put it more bluntly, I don't think there is anyone, and Mahmoud Khwaja is here, who is an expert on chemicals of all kinds. I don't know if the government of Pakistan is aware of the economic implications of the phase out. What are the quantities we are talking about? Because these chemicals are apparently used in the industry also.
Yes.
So there is no inventory of chemicals in this country. And this was the problem that made it impossible for Pakistan to submit its INDC document for COP21.
Right.
It wasn't because of political will. It was because of the nalaiki, the incompetence of the Pakistani system, because of the poor state of education, the poor state of monitoring, the poor state of statistics. So, but that is, my feeling is Kigali will produce an agreement. It will be unwise on the part of Pakistan to stand in the way of a consensus. And what Pakistan should do is to suggest, elaboration of amendments in an appropriate form, whether it comes in that amended annexure or in any other way, whereby it mentions the capacity building for the initial baseline studies and then the assistance for the phase out. And the other problem that we may have, but I don't think that is a big problem, is the trajectory. I think 15 years would be okay. The North American proposal was a little more ambitious, but that is also was a position. So if Kigali can come up with that, and maybe even in the developing countries to have differentiated trajectories, because there are developing countries that produce HFCs and there are developing countries that only import them and use them. So I hope, as you rightly said, the Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif is committed to this topic, and this was a mention, it was a paragraph in the joint communique that was issued after his visit to Washington. Similar references, of course, came in the joint communiques with India earlier. And so I hope that the ministry, people who represent Pakistan, will not go against the promise that the Prime Minister has made, and You know, my worry is that the typical thing in Pakistan is if you don't understand the topic, postpone action. So, you know, sometimes our negotiators say, I have no instructions from the capital. Sometimes they hide behind every pretext for putting off the decision. So my proposal to Pakistan from this civil society forum is to respect the promise that the Prime Minister had made and to appear to be enthusiastic about addressing the threat of climate change. As you rightly said, this chemical is 12,000 times more damaging than the others. So, and also to prepare a pathway for the gradual phase out of the imports. It is better for Pakistan to do it now rather than wait for the imposition of licensing system. Because if the industrialized countries come up with licensing and they ban the import of chemicals, you know, refuse to give permits to industries producing them, then we'll be left really high and dry. And as you talked about this, there are so many social and other benefits. So I don't know if I have said what I wanted to say clearly, but I think it is an objective of the climate change policy of Pakistan to contribute to global efforts to address the threat of climate change. It will also be a sign of our earnestness to protect our national interest and to garner support for our climate change related assistance. You know, you can't be a negative actor on the international level and yet expect generous support. Thank you so much, Amreen, for coming out and explaining this. I wish we had a few weeks before, you know, you had come a few weeks before the Kigali meeting, because I am absolutely not aware whether the brief has been finalized. There are any number of drafts circulating. So which one is Pakistan associating itself with? I have no problem with the Indian proposal, although it sort of speaks more about the producing countries. But the worst thing Pakistan can do is to express broad but vague kind of reservations. We should come out openly, talk about our limitations, including the lack of facilities for preparing statistics and baseline studies on the current uses and scenarios of future uses or reductions in a phase map. Thank you so much, Amreen, and I wish you all success in your efforts. It's a very noble effort. I was one of the most eloquent supporters, and also used to describe it as the great success, and said, look, emulate this example for other issues.
Absolutely.
So I wish you all the best, and I thank you all, and apologize if I haven't prepared this my remarks, so I may be a bit off the mark.
No, it's excellent. It's excellent. Thank you so much.
A spontaneous sort of impact or sort of a comment on the lecture which was required. Thank you very much. Now the floor is open for questions, and taking full advantage of moderating it, I would like to ask one of the questions, and please raise your hands.
Can I ask a question?
Any other question?
Our panelist has a question.
Yeah.
Amreen, you're sitting in Washington.
Yes.
And you mentioned the 80 million promise from the private sector,
Yes.
which the White House also
Yes.
highlighted in a statement.
Yes.
can you give us a hunch, if not a formal answer? Will it be possible for a study, and Mahmood Khwaja can help in that, to prepare an inventory of the current, the quantities of HFCs coming into Pakistan?
Yes. That's an excellent question, and it's a very critical question. So while I was standing here, I ended my initial talk by saying the role of people in this room is to educate, participate, and question. So one of the big questions right now that Pakistanis have a right to know is, what is the actual figures, facts and figures related to HFCs in Pakistan? Because without that information, how will you know how HFCs are affecting you now and how the phase out of HFCs will affect you? You have to have concrete data. And if the government does not have concrete data, there is capacity building support to garner that data through UNDP and through this fund. There are different ways in which those countries asking for that support can immediately receive that support for capacity building of their ministries right now. And there are several developing countries that I know of who are in the same boat as Pakistan. So the main question about this particular, you said about the commitment of developed countries. This is the major issue. This is a major issue in many international agreements, but particularly with respect to the Montreal Protocol. I have in my hand an article here about countries, it's talking about adopting clean energy. It's an article that appeared last week in Thomson Reuters Foundation, and I thought that the rhetoric was very appropriate for the Montreal Protocol. So the title of the article is "Rich Nations Can Protect Their Own Best Interests by Helping the Poorest Countries Adopt Clean Power." And so this particular article is about clean power. And in it, the author says, rich countries need to pay poor ones. Why? Because it is in their own self-interest. And it argues that poor countries would like to invest in environmental initiatives. But in the developing world, development is often not synonymous with environmentalism. And so their ability to develop quickly will be impeded by the transition to clean energy or climate-friendly alternatives in this case, unless and until they are given some compensation for what they are giving up in fast development. So I like this article because I think it presents developing countries' perspectives, and they are all united in this perspective, which is, if the developed world wants this from us, which we are willing to do, we understand we're the most vulnerable countries to climate change, then you have to help us. So this is why this particular, and I passed around an article about this, why these donor countries and philanthropists announced their intent to provide $80 million in support to help countries in need of assistance to implement the amendment. And it breaks it down. These 16 donor countries and 19 philanthropists enable countries to begin developing programs to track and reduce HFCs. So to track is really your question. How do you track these imports? And help their consumers and businesses realize the net economic benefits from energy efficiency as they transition to HFC alternatives. So this initial private grant is just one source of potential funding for countries to determine the facts and figures. They need these statistics. They cannot form intelligent policy without statistics. I'm sure that the government has engaged in some of this data gathering. I'm sure some of it will continue to evolve, especially as the new technologies are developed.
I'm not sure.
Well, that is another, I guess we don't know. It's uncertain, right? But how will it happen without the urging of the people in this room? This is why we're bringing you here to talk about the fact that this is a major gap in information, right? You have to have the information if you're going to develop if you're going to sign a major agreement. You must know exactly how many HFCs you're using, what that amounts to in terms of your costs, how your costs will be impacted by substituting new chemicals, and what that process entails, step by step, in each sector. And do you have buy-in and goodwill from each of those affected? So it's a very good question. I think it's one of the key questions. I think people in this room have to amplify that argument and do your part in understanding to what extent is the government gathering this data and providing it to the public, right? Anyway,
Sorry,
I don't think that really answered your question, but
Just open up the
Absolutely.
floor
Okay, good.
for question answers, but someone from, would say the official word, we have the joint secretary from the
Oh,
university.
wonderful,
That's-
wonderful. After Sri Lanka.
I'm here on special invitation.
Achha, all right.
For the subject, and I'm just like to sit here as a listener.
Okay.
Instead of delivering a submission later on, I face an A&E proceedings.
Okay, if you don't want to. So I was just, before I put it to Parisa, do you think that at the different phases of development, when the first bird was developing, there was no limit and they were spewing carbon all around and everything, and you know all.
they were.
And they developed.
And they
now
developed.
the third bird is developing.
And now the third world is
Now the
developing.
third bird is developing because of their doing.
Absolutely.
The third bird find hurdles.
Absolutely.
So the compensation package
Yes.
for the third bird, do you think it's enough in the kitty to
No.
do justice? Because if you're talking about the law, Montreal,
Right.
there should be some semblance of justice
As justice,
in the
yes.
community of nations.
Yes.
Because it's,
You're right. So the question is, do you think there is enough money right now?
Yeah.
No. I'm not divulging any secrets from international negotiations. No developing country that I know of thinks that this is enough money. Because they're looking, even India is looking at their costs and seeing them grow and saying there's no way. 80 million doesn't even touch one developing country needs. So how can you do this? It has to be a multi-stakeholder process. Multiple donor agencies and donor countries have to be involved. There has to be a long-term plan in place to support at each phase. There has to be small incremental phases of instituting this agreement. You know, in biting off, not so you don't bite off more than you can chew, you take it in small steps. I mean, I think that there are different proposals from different countries suited to their own national interests. So do I think there's enough money? We hope that developed countries have heard the call and the challenge to step up to fund this initiative. We think that this $80 million fund, this is another copy you can hand out. We think that this $80 million fund, it is a step in the right direction. It's just one step. I think it's the first step
And a
of
baby one.
many. It might be a baby step, but it's a huge public commitment for 19 philanthropies and multiple donor countries to stand up and say, we believe in this. We must invest in this. It's because it's our future. All of our futures, all of our environmental future is linked in one global atmosphere. So none of us is isolated from the other, regardless of if you are a developed country or developing. But then this is the challenge: is how do developing countries meet their development in a sustainable manner without taking advantage of these polluting, mechanisms. So if you expect them to continue in your own national interests, then you have to provide them with an alternative that is as attractive, if not more. So
We have with
It's a
us
challenge. Yes,
Dr.
Salam
Mahmood
alaikum.
Khwaja, and he's experts in chemical. He played a key part in getting in Manamata agreement and just phasing out mercury. And mercury, so Dr. you want to ask a question, please?
Thank you very much, Tahir, and also I'm thankful to Shafat who very kindly mentioned me twice. These are these chemicals. I mean, STPI for 20 years I have been working on chemicals and
yes.
sustainable district development. And I was a member of the negotiation of 3 protocols. We start from the SICOM and then more recently the mercury.
You should actually be sitting here instead of me.
No,
You have much more experience.
One can contribute from backbenches also.
Yes, yes.
As long as it is valuable and useful.
Oh, I'm grateful. I'm
I will
grateful.
try to be very focused.
Nay, of
because
course,
I could see
please.
very enthusiastic people around who want to share their thoughts
Yes.
also. The problem is not that there is not information policy. The information is there. But unfortunately, it is not disseminated properly. It does not go to right people. To quote 2 examples. Chapter, we have an inventory on ozone depleting substances prepared in 92-93. Then
Those were the challenge for CFCs.
Let me finish. Then we also have a chemical profile of Pakistan. which gives you information about chemicals and those industries which produce those chemicals and where they are consumed and so on and so forth. Then we also have an inventory on persistent organic pollutant, POPs, prepared in 2001. Then STPI prepared a report, Environmental Profile of Pakistan, which has a chapter on ozone depleting substances. But again, unfortunately, we couldn't publish it. Then more lately, we have inventory on mercury. But then there is one problem, that the information dissemination is not there. The information exchange is not there. The information does not go to the relevant people. And secondly, you have to authenticate this data. Because the way this data is collected leaves data question. But all the same, a baseline is there. How good it is, that's another big question. I would only raise just one question, and that is to both you and Shivata. I also have experience of this, following these negotiations, international negotiations. But what has puzzled me always, why this Montreal Protocol was successful. To me, it is not the reasons which you two have very kindly shared, or probably there are secondary reasons. I think, to me, ozone depletion or climate change is such which affect the whole world in a very, very quick, fast way. And all this process comes through air, which has no boundary. The other chemicals, which are as important as ozone depleting substances and others, they are not as volatile or they don't transport as quickly as does the ozone depleting substances. So there was a global impact, and the developing country, the developed country didn't want to have that impact on them. It was their priority to save themselves, that they put in an impeded funding thing in the Montreal Protocol. Why that impending funding mechanism cannot come in the other protocols? Why? The political will is there, the issues are important, there is a scientific base, but the impeding financial mechanism does not come in those protocols. So, I mean, so to me, this is why Montreal Protocol was so successful, and the others are not. Even the countries get down from what they committed by way of financial consultation. So, I mean, there are other issues also. I mean, like, it's easy to talk about the energy efficiency, but we should also talk of energy conservation. And
yes.
Also this technology transfer. You know, it's a beautiful word. But then there are problems of pre-technology transfer and post-technology transfer, which are usually not looked into. You only go for technology transfer without giving attention to pre-technology transfer and post-technology transfer. And that's what happened. The funding goes just waste. You have things in which no more work. Then they are difficult to maintain.
Yes.
That's it. So,
yes.
So these are problems. We can talk later on that.
Yes.
Putting the money where their mouth is.
Where their mouth is. So this, I mean,
Not giving us anything.
So this is actually, if you could give this article to him, because I think this says exactly what you, if you could pass this.
Yeah.
This says exactly what you're saying, which is that it is in their own self-interest to fund this particular phase down of chemicals. And so, but your point about information dissemination is very key. I think this is something within.
If you allow me just one second.
Yes, yes.
Please, brief yourself very, very well
Yes.
of what is we have and what we don't have.
Yes.
Before you propose an action.
Yes, I agree. I mean, it's up to the negotiators on the ground and the government representatives on the ground to represent the country's interests, including everybody in this room, the industry, the SDPI, all the stakeholders. It's up to them. I think that they do have resources of information. And what limited resources that have been available to the public, I know of. But I think you're right. I think authentication of that data, constant reevaluation of that data is key. Everything has to be developed from the perspective of scientific expertise and clear data on what is going on in Pakistan. I mean, up till now, I don't even think Pakistan has a population census that is agreed upon that it is accurate. So this data gathering is a challenge everywhere, not just in Pakistan. So to that extent, I agree with you that that needs to be consistently evaluated, and it's up to the negotiators ultimately and the government to figure this out. And so your point about not funding other protocols, that is a question of why, I mean, what happens on the international stage and how agreements are designed that are far above my pay grade. But from my humble perspective, I would say this is one of the reasons why the Montreal Protocol is a favorable treaty for Pakistan to sign, because it does have some type of mechanism to implement it that does aid in its implementation. It may not be as much money as they like or as much money as they need, but at least there is some effort to make it more viable. Energy conservation, your point, as to energy efficiency and energy conservation are both well taken. In terms of the technology transfer, so one of the big concerns that the developing countries have put forward is related to intellectual property and the patents held on the alternatives to HFCs. And so there's an interesting study that I'm happy to provide you all with. I can email it to you, but I have a hard copy here. And in the context of India, it's specific to India, but it examines this issue of patent protection. And what ways in which countries may overcome the technology transfer issue and the intellectual property issue. It's a very complicated issue, but I think this is something that, again, the negotiators will and have discussed as how this will actually make its way into the text of the amendment. So we will have to see how this process evolves. But I'm happy to provide you with this document as well that might help answer some of your questions. Please, would love for you to weigh in on these points.
Yeah. Mr. Dimali, he is a researcher with the with the research wing of the Business Recorder, which is Financial Times of Pakistan. Mr. Dimali.
I just have two quick questions. One is for you. You mentioned that Indian officials are saying that they need probably up to $2 billion.
Billion,
yeah. Up to $2 billion to convert, to shift to a transit to a new
In a
economy.
15-year period.
Yeah. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I recall, the INDC document prepared by India said very clearly that they too suffer from lack of sufficient data so far as climate change and is concerned. So how is it that they were able to arrive at a number that, okay, this is the amount that we're going to get, or is it just a number made out of thin air? And so that's one question. And the second question to you is really, so we moved from CFCs to HCFCs, and now we are trying to move from that to HFCs. In this whole climate change and environmental discourse, there is something called the rebound effect. And I'd like to understand what would be the rebound effect of the HFC on overall climate change.
I'll let you take the India question
First one, yeah.
Yes.
I don't know. I only read
Okay.
what Sinha wrote. I know him on 28th of September.
Okay.
He says, he's given it a very positive line. He says India will be flexible and it will only point out the requirements which, according to the original Vienna Convention and Montreal Protocol, all the incremental costs have to be borne by a mechanism set up, under the convention.
Now, I'm just intrigued whether, in the sense that whether when they could come up with a number without, when they too suffer from lack of sufficient
No, but
data,
the Indian
I couldn't
INDC document, which I like actually, is a very good document because it doesn't claim that we know all. It says that as a developing country, we have limitations. And so our actions for climate change will have to be based on an understanding of this, that in many cases we don't know. We don't have sufficient statistics. All the statistics are not sort of reliable or are updated and authenticated, as Mahmoud Khwaja mentioned. So...
But that situation is not unique to India. There are many countries that face challenges regarding data. So one way, for example, I'm not saying anybody is doing this, so do not quote me on this or tweet this out. But, for example, if I were a developing country and I were in negotiations and I didn't have exact numbers and I didn't have time to develop exact numbers, I would say, okay, put a provision in there that says that I will not be obligated to phase down without, for example, adequate, until the technology becomes available. meaning that the clock does not start ticking on my obligations until technology becomes available. This is one way to phrase it without exact numbers. Or by saying, for example, with adequate funding, I will commit to XYZ. Right?
That's a smart way to do it.
Yeah, that's one way to sort
But
of.
when you put a number, then really, I mean, there has to be some method to that.
A smart way to block.
The other thing, Avareen, is that I understand that at the moment the bulk of the substitutes for HFCs are produced by 2 American companies or 3, DuPont
And Honeywell.
yeah.
Yes.
Now, another way of dealing with this situation is if they can overcome the intellectual property rights questions and encourage a massive production of the substitutes, so that China can pick it up, India can do it and all, and you will have substitutes at affordable price. Ji.
Or share the corporate profits.
It's a very valid observation, but this point was raised almost 1.5 years by Pakistan during the international negotiation process, and it was not agreed because they said that we are not the intellectual property right holder as such. We are here governments negotiating, and that's the private concern of the private company. The field is open.
No, one of the advantages of being old is that you are able to predict what the negotiation, how the negotiations are likely to
say and not. Yeah.
to be held.
But I mean, even if the IPR has, not, the current proposals on the table, the current discussion is that developed countries will have to phase down these chemicals first. So they have to be the most ambitious in leading the way. And then after 5, 10, 15, however many years they agree upon, there's this differentiated responsibility. Then the lesser developed countries can phase out the chemicals. And phase out the chemicals according to their schedule. So different countries can argue that, say, I'd like to phase down in this sector, I'd like to phase down in the second sector when the technology is available to me and the patents expire. Right? I mean, there's different ways, like I'm saying, there's different ways of wording the agreement and arguing for a text that supports your point, even if you don't have hard numbers. So I think this is up to the negotiators are much more experienced and knowledgeable than I am, so they know how and when to make these different, concessions or not. But definitely, I think lesser developed countries are trying to protect their interests. And have made their arguments. I think their concerns have been heard, as evidenced by this $80 million fund promulgated by the White House and their partners. So I think that that's, again, just one step. And the more that the public is educated and the more the public keeps raising these issues as important to them, because they're logical issues, the more I think that consensus can be reached, because all the stakeholders will have had input. So your input is very important, and I think it's being heard at the highest
But
level.
my request, to you, sir, is that in Kigali, are you going to Kigali or who's going? In Kigali, we should not stand in the way of consensus. There are 2 ways of handling when the consensus is too overwhelming. One is to mobilize support for your reservations, and the other is to put certain conditionalities.
Right.
I think in this case the second option would be proper, and Pakistan should couple its acceptance of the amendment or the proposals with a very clear statement of its needs for capacity building, for technology transfer and deployment, and for,
Absolutely.
which Prime Minister ने वादा किया उसके खिलाफ ना जाए, because then the Americans will again come to the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister will issue instruction. It has been decided by the Prime Minister that Pakistan should accept the amendment. तो उससे तो बेहतर ये है कि आप दुनिया भर में एक obstructionist की शक्ल में ना नजर आए.
Yeah. And the rebound.
Rebound effect.
Your question was CFCs to transition to HCFCs and then HFCs. But then we are making these transitions as if we are suddenly being enlightened each time that these are horrible chemicals. So what will happen 10 years from now? Is that your question? That when we discover HFCs are also?
Yeah, I mean, so technology has this rebound effect. So every now so often we say that, well, okay, efficient technology is an issue for climate change and so on and so forth. But then the technology becomes efficient, but then the frequency and the quantum of usage becomes sort of increases many folds, and therefore the overall impact on the environment is only ends up sort of increasing. So, so for instance, there was a time when the ACs used to be like this big, yeah, and it used to produce lots of dangerous gases. I'm not a scientific man, so I don't know, but I'm told that they produce lots of dangerous gases. And over time it became smaller and efficient. But previously, if two out of 100 people had those big ACs, now 100 out of 100 people have those ACs. So it has become smaller, it has become efficient, but because the consumption has increased many folds, the overall impact is in fact bigger, and that's what you can say broadly can be defined as a rebound effect. And so what I'm trying to understand is that is there any rebound effect of the HFCs and whatever cleaner solution that we're trying to offer?
So I think the answer to that question lies in energy efficiency. So I think that is why not only with the separate $80 million fund, but also with the energy efficiency movement is now closely aligned with this movement to phase out HFCs. Because industry experts and scientific experts have caught this issue from the beginning, that you cannot just phase out, as Dr. Khwaja was saying earlier, if you phase out HFCs, you're stuck with these old, inefficient air conditioning units. 15 years from now, you can replace it with a better chemical. You will still have bad technology that's sucking the energy out of Pakistan, out of the grid. And then you will have to leapfrog, right? Because you'll have to make two transitions, not only chemically, but equipment-wise. So from the beginning now, countries are trying to anticipate that type of arrangement and come up with a more holistic solution from the beginning. That here we will provide money for energy efficiency, and we will try to have the dually reinforcing impact of reducing the chemical and changing out the equipment, the physical equipment itself. So these types of strategies by people much smarter than me, I think are an attempt to address what you are discussing. And I think that it's worth considering and worth acknowledging. Again, the process of continuously educating yourself about the new solutions that are being put forward. Because energy efficiency was not a huge part of the discussion until maybe six months ago. The Montreal Protocol amendment negotiations have been going on for 7-8 years, as the ambassador mentioned, since he was originally involved. So only within the last, recent history is energy efficiency on the table, in part in response to this. How do we do more with less, as the ambassador said in his article, and how do we do it better? How do we not repeat the same mistake, and catch the issues to the extent that we can? Because I don't think anybody can 100% predict whether or not HFCs are going to have the elimination, the ultimate solution. It's not an ultimate solution. It's one piece. There you still have to cut carbon emissions across the board according to the Paris Agreement. I mean, there are many, many things that have to be. He mentioned conservation, as a critical piece. So, but it's a good question. It's a fair question to keep reiterating as to how to keep tabs on this issue, because it requires constant monitoring. You cannot just say, okay, hey, we'll replace this HFC, we're done. It won't work like that. There will always be new technology, new innovation. Maybe, I hope one day from Pakistan as well, as a leader, in the climate change and environmental issues, that Pakistan might produce alternatives in its own country, alternative solutions that are comprehensive. So, it's a good question. Good questions.
So, thank you very much. If there is no question, you are invited to a cup of tea, and we can continue your discussion on financial basis over there. So,
thank you very much to everybody for attending. Thank you again, Ambassador. Thank you, SCPI as well. your extemporaneous speaking on this issue, Mathal, because you're such a... Yes, thank you so much. I'm so glad that, for your question, a very good question. Yes, excellent. Yes, I spoke with Dr. Solari about, I spoke with Dr. Solari about producing a policy